is transcendental meditation the same thing?
It's a part of that family. So all of that stuff, all of the Eastern mysticism of TM. TM comes in the 60s. You see TM. That's why in lecture 1, he talks about Peter Jones talks about coming over on the same or different planes than John Lennon, his boyhood friend. And he talks about, he says different planes in terms of, literally it was a different airplane, but 2 different spiritual planes. And then Lennon goes on to transform culture. I go on to write about culture. Well, with the Beatles and their pop music comes all of, Hare Krishnaism, all of that starts to come in, not just with them, but Shirley MacLaine comes on the scene shortly after. But the Beatles, there's no question that they introduce quite a bit of this. And it becomes, Eastern mysticism becomes mainstream in the 60s. So again, I'll get to that, but yes, very much so.
Is this, you think, in your opinion, is this a cyclic issue since the time of Jesus, where it rise and fall of these problems, or is this a continuous uphill battle?
It's an excellent question. Is this a cycle since the time of Jesus or a continuous uphill battle? Since you asked me and not another Christian, then I'll give you my opinion. But I say that because there's going to be a range of answers on that, depending on one's view of what's called eschatology, the end times. Okay. Is this ramping up and we are in the last days and Antichrist is at our doorstep? That I can't tell you. From one perspective, I could say yes, but 5 minutes later, given my particular understanding of the last days that we've been in them for 2,000 years, and that so many people have made predictions, right, that have not come true, then I hesitate to say yes. But I do say things are getting worse. Here's what I can say. What we're seeing is part and parcel of. So I subscribe to something called the 2-age theory, that there's the present age and the age to come, right? And so we are in the present age, the now. The not yet is breaking in with Jesus. The kingdom of God comes with him, but it's not yet fully here, right? During the whole period of the now, translation, until his second coming, you're going to see surges of this, cycles of this. But I do believe that the trajectory, if you will, you're going to see cycles, but it's ramping up, right? From our point of view, it might look like, whoa, it's really kicking up there. But who's to say we're not in for the third great awakening? And all of a sudden, I don't know that. It could be. So that's where I'm really hesitant. I just say we need to be ready for his return at any moment. We are seeing, not to get too off track, but we're seeing more people groups reached with the gospel. That's a definite sign that's a good sign, right? Took us a long time as Christians, but that's a good sign. And this gospel will go out to all nations, right? And then the end shall come. But how the Lord may define people groups is a little maybe different than the way I'm defining it. So to quote the late Dr. Billy Graham, everything seems to be happening right on schedule with God's timing. I just don't know God's timing. But yeah, you do see cycles of this in history, including, and maybe that kind of leads into today. And this is really a resurgence of paganism, what we're seeing, and a resurgence of Gnosticism, as we talked about last week. And in that sense, it's cyclical. There's nothing new under the sun. Let me spend a couple seconds on Gnosticism. Gnosticism, because last week in last week's lecture, Gnosticism was, he said that this is, that Carl Jung, the eminent psychologist of much of the last century, was a new Gnostic, Gnostic, silent G, right? Gnosticism. Gnosticism was prevalent in the late 1st century, definitely all throughout the 2nd and the 3rd century AD. So the early church dealt with this heresy. We don't know exactly where it started. The traditional theory is it started actually with Simon Magus, but that is possibly much more conjecture than it is based in reality. But at the very least, if you remember that story where he wanted to purchase the Holy Spirit, give me that, right? Give me that power. And then it looks like he gives a profession of faith, and history goes on to show that he did not remain faithful at all. But he had enough Jesus, if you will, to be dangerous. And he went out and, so the theory goes, came up with this new religion. Let's take him out of it and say, well, what did the Gnostics believe? They believed in a Gnostic God. They believed in a Gnostic Christ. And they believed that all you had to do as a human to get in touch with the divine was find out the secret way, the secret knowledge. Gnosis, Gnostic, means knowledge. You, every human being, has a spark of the divine within you. There's something in you that is divine. So already it separates itself from biblical Christianity. We are not divine at all, right? Hence the oneism. Oneism, all is one. Biblical Christianity, no, I'm separate from the deity. But Gnosticism says, no, you're not separate from the deity. That's the secret. You are divine. You just have to tap into it. You have to find that. And the way that and then when you do find that, the cosmic Christ will fall upon you, because you too can be Christ. Jesus became the Christ. You can become the Christ if you just knew the knowledge. And there are all sorts of angelic intermediaries, spirit guides that you tap into to help you get to oneness. And from there, it just branches out, but it makes its way in. And so when in the book of Revelation, when we run into an early church nemesis named Marcion, and actually not Revelation, it's after Revelation. It's the early church, the Marcionites. This is a sect of Christianity that broke off, but they were much more Gnostic than they were Christian. But they, think about it, if you're not discerning, if I mention Christ, and if I mention, I just want to be godly, and there's a secret knowledge where I publish a book called The Secret, right? Which was not, wasn't that long ago that book was popular. Well, if I tell you, here's the latest way, Christians, sadly, we fall for this. We fall for the latest way to tap into the deity. And the whole idea that I can tap into him personally and have a direct personal relationship with personal revelations, that flows out of actually more Gnosticism than it does biblical Christianity. You only see the prophets and the apostles having personal revelations, Christ himself, of course. You don't see this for the regular, everyday Christian. And so do you have God guiding and speaking to us through his word and his apostles? Of course, he speaks to every individual Christian. But it's when I start to talk about, I had a personal revelation from God, that's actually flowing out of Gnosticism, more so than it is biblical Christianity. And that's because the two sadly became wed in some circles early in church history. And so we want to be careful regarding what this is. Let me go ahead and read a few chapters or a few pages from the first chapter. Yeah.
We don't need to get up on this now, but it's not another important component of Gnosticism, dualism between matter and the spirit.
Yes.
The material world and spiritual world.
Yes. No, thank you. Thank you. And that's also a very Greek thing, right?
We should repeat that.
And so a part of Gnosticism is the dualism. There is anything rational, right? Anything having to do with matter or rationality is bad. Spirit is good. Hence, feelings or contact from the Spirit, what I perceive versus what I've rationally thought. So doctrine, if I were to sit down and we'd go through, all right, what's the doctrine of, and introduce a doctrine, we can have a good rational debate from Scripture. The Gnostics are not interested in that, because that is trying to codify it, use my rational mind, use my brain. This is bad. I need to shed this, including the brain inside. I need to get to what is really me, and what is really me is spirit. And so anytime I can become spiritual and esoteric, that's a good thing by default. Whenever I stop and have a rational conversation, by default, that's a bad thing. So that does not jive well with, again, biblical Christianity, which presents to us propositions and truths from Scripture, meant to have affect a very real relationship. But God speaks to us through words, right? That's how we know him. He speaks to us through words, and those words have meaning. And it's meant to say, come, let us reason together, says the Lord. Well, that's a very anti-Gnostic statement by God. So with that in mind, are you a Oneist or a Twoist? This is about 10 pages long. I'm just going to kind of read through it and then hit a summation and then go into his lecture. All right. 1 and 2 refer to two antithetical worldviews, oneism, twoism. The ism part makes the world into a distinctive system or theory. And so oneism is the theory of oneness. Twoism is the theory of two-ness. Now, while I, Peter Jones, take responsibility for coining these terms, I take no credit for inventing the meanings that they convey. Oneism believes all is one and shares the same essential nature. Theologians use the term consubstantiality. As you may or may not know, con means with in Latin, and you know what substantial means, substance or essence. In oneism, everything shares the same essence. In a word, everything is a piece of the divine. Twoism believes that while all of creation shares a certain essence, everything apart from God is created, the creator of nature, namely God, is a completely different being whose will determines the nature and the function of all created things. Everything you do and think is affected by how you answer the question, are you a Oneist or a Twoist? The Apostle Paul clearly describes these two options, and there are only two, in one of the most staggeringly simple and ideologically profound verses of the Bible, Romans 1:25. They, humans, exchanged the truth about God for the lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Here, Paul identifies only two possible kinds of worship: worship of creation or worship of the creator. Behind each is a consistently worked out, timeless worldview, either oneism or twoism. Paul calls oneism, all is one, the lie, and twoism, the truth. All of humanity falls into one category or the other. There is no third way. This is Paul's surprising 1-2 punch, which serves as the inspiration and the structural outline for the following pages, not only of Romans, but this book I'm quoting from, Exegetes of Romans in this context. I've written this way because Paul, who wrote in the 1st century, speaks in an oddly direct fashion to those of us living in the 21st century. His wisdom will help us dissipate our cloud of confusion. I don't expect the message of this book to receive praise from all lips. Its key argument contradicts what many people today consider to be true. Regressive or progressive? Now we hear these terms, right? Progressive. Politicians hold out the hope of transformation and an improved society. The truth that we need is progressive, they say. As today's Newspeak phrase going forward would suggest, error is regressive, backward looking. Old news is bad news. Futurists boldly believe that they are creating a new worldview. There's a futurist website called Zeitgeist, and it declares, quote, the human value system must be updated and changed through education and thoughtful introspection. And the environment surrounding that value system must change to support the new worldview. And so addressing gay leaders in the White House in 2009, President Obama used his presidential bully pulpit to declare that the foes of homosexuality are holding on to worn arguments and old attitudes. So let me pause there. You don't want to be regressive in today's society. I'm not saying as Christians. I'm just saying today's society would say if you're backwards looking, if you believe that any of the changing morals are wrong, and if you were to actually use those words, then that's a bad thing because you're looking backwards. But the new worldview is we have to be ever evolving and accepting of that which is new and challenges the old patriarchal system or the old a term called cisgender, which I'll get to. If you don't know that, I'll get to in a few lectures when we get into pagan sexuality and get into more homosexual and transsexual and pansexual views of the world. That's a good thing. Going backwards and saying, no, there are only two genders, that's a bad thing. All right. So, but I'm telling you nothing new. I'm just letting you know this is what's on your news. And by the way, he wrote this in 2010. And so how much of this is even more true, right? And the lectures we're watching are from 2014. Christians must not allow self-identified futurists and progressives to lay claim to truth. And yet they are, aren't they? Be they presidents, professors, or pastors. It is all spin. Now, to be sure, history changes and technology develops. The 21st century is new relative to the 20th century. So not everything's new is wrong, right? Just as the moment that I'm typing this sentence is new relative to the moment that I typed the last sentence. This is what time does. It creates new events that become history. We're facing new opportunities and problems, especially those of globalism and technology. How do we organize ourselves in a world that communicates instantly from any point on the globe, even from space? What unique applications of ethical principles should be applied to cloning, stem cell research, or euthanasia? We must use our minds creatively and wisely to find intelligent responses to these new questions. Now, even in that sentence, we must use our minds. That's a very anti-Gnostic, anti-pagan point of view, because he's saying, let's reason together. Let's use technology. Let's use science. Let's use our knowledge versus our feelings and what is most pragmatic. But a new worldview, although many of our practical and technical problems are new, the only worldview solutions on offer are very old. To call a belief system progressive or regressive is a spin zone. It obscures the truth. And so he says, be assured the spin stops here. Just as Christianity makes no bones about going backwards to Paul, to Jesus, even to Moses' account of the creation of man, contemporary progressive thinking also goes backwards, appealing to the ancient lie, that is Satan, which consists of notions popular thousands of years ago. The quote unquote new spiritualists, all this TM stuff that we talked about earlier, who argue most strenuously for biological and spiritual evolution, exhort their disciples to return to the spirituality of the past for morality and wisdom. Among themselves, intellectual pagan Oneists call themselves traditionalists, oddly enough. Some researchers believe that science is poised to bring in a new age of understanding, not through new texts, but through old ones, such as the ancient Gnostic Hermetica. You can look up some of these. I bet you one of them you've heard of, though. The medieval Kabbalist Zohar, you've heard the Kabbalah or Kabbalah, right? Maybe you've heard of that. Or the 5th century BC Hindu text, the Bhagavad Gita. I'm sure you've heard of the Bhagavad Gita, at least heard of it, right? Contemporary gurus who teach methods of relaxation, meditation, and altered states of consciousness to West Coast yuppies in sweet-smelling gyms on Sunset Boulevard. And he lives out there in California, so he can take these shots. Also take their customers back to the Bhagavad Gita. While Western gurus who teach oneness with nature for the sake of ecological survival find their models of spirituality in the ancient nature worship of Mayan, Aztec, Incan, and North American Indian peoples. Are these also worn arguments and old attitudes? If so, what does progressive really mean then? Because they're going backwards, they're just appealing to different sources. In spite of claims that humanity is ever evolving to higher stages of consciousness, the spiritual options practiced with such zeal in the 21st century have been known forever. And so let's be honest, there's nothing new. Thousands of years ago, an ancient text recognized this fact. Ecclesiastes 1, 9 and 10. What has been is what will be. And what has been done is what will be done. There's nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It's already been in the ages before us. Seeing today's utopian futurists in this ancient text brings them down to size. Solomon, the wise, testifies against the reckless self-confidence that boasts, we can work it out. If even the Beatles couldn't, why should we succeed? There's nothing wrong with going backwards. Everyone does it. But here is something sort of new. According to Paul, you don't need a 3-inch thick phone book to access the inventory of spiritual possibilities. Many people believe there are as many ways to enlightenment as there are days in the year. In fact, there are only 2, and they've been around forever. That's been the truth since the world began, and it will remain the truth until God steps in to put an end to our arrogance. And this is what gets scary, the new Rome. Not only does everyone appeal to the past, but our times quite resemble the old days of the Apostle Paul. Were the rabbi to land at Dulles International Airport and take a tour of Washington, D.C., he would find many similarities to pagan Roman Empire, in which he wrote to the small community of Christians in the capital city. I collaborated on this parallel in a previous book, Capturing the Pagan Mind, which readers can consult at their leisure. Google has millions of references to America as the new Rome. Consider these facts. Rome was invaded by the religions of the East, so that pagan syncretism and religious tolerance produced in the Roman Empire, in the words of one historian, a common interfaith world religion. Rome was sports and entertainment mad and choking on sexual excess. Does this look familiar? Rome dominated the civilized world politically and created a global empire. As I look at modern culture imploding around us, I'm reminded of Italian Federico Fellini's X-rated Satyricon, the 1969 sexual extravaganza loosely based on the story of a Roman courtier at the time of Nero. And there are his dates. I didn't watch the film, but the story recounts bawdy episodes of Roman debauchery, including prostitution, orgies, homosexual and hermaphrodite trysts, gay marriage, pedophilia. Such parties occurred at the precise time when Christians were being burned on poles to light up Nero's garden soirees. And that's true. I don't know if you knew that, but that's how Nero would celebrate his parties. You and I, we get our backyard, anti-mosquito candles, and he literally was lighting up Christians and putting them on poles. And so when Peter is encouraging the church, talking about the fire, that persecution in terms of being fire, there's a possibility that he had a very real fire in mind, Nero's fires. But Nero was a nasty, nasty man. And when the Apostle Paul was beheaded for, among other things, writing Romans chapter 1, this was all happening. At the same time, this is what Nero did. He married 2 homosexual lovers, Pythagoras, to whom he acted as a wife. So Pythagoras was the husband, Nero was the wife. And then he also married Sporus, whom he had castrated and made empress. So then he's acting as the husband to this Sporus. So in one sense, he's acting as a wife, then he's acting as a husband. Was Paul's opposition to homosexuality based on worn arguments and old attitudes? If so, then Nero's view of sexuality was just as worn and old, since it was typical of the ancient pagan world. A few years after Paul's death in AD 66, there was a Roman historian named Tacitus. He described Christians as haters of humanity, even though Christians were the ones rescuing cast-off newborns. The Romans would cast off their newborns and put them in the gutters, and Christians would go around and take them. This is fact. This is widely out there. This is history. They would go and they would pick them up and clean them and raise them. And so do we cast off our newborns today in society? Of course we do. And Christians are called haters, right? They were haters, perhaps more accurately hated, because they refused to go along with the cruelty and the perversions of the day, which were justified back then as part of what's called the Pax Romana, Roman peace for the common good. And so here we are in 2021 with the world turned on its head. Even in 1969, few would have dreamed that such ancient perversions recaptured by voyeuristic Hollywood to feed the culture's newly awakened fantasies, would become culturally accepted realities and even be protected from criticism by new hate crime laws of the land, all for the common good. Rome was pagan and then was Christianized. America was, quote, Christian, and now is becoming pagan. A worldview understanding of recent changes can be greatly enriched in light of the long historical perspective we get when we hear what Paul, an ancient Roman citizen, a Jewish rabbi, and a Christian apostle, has to say to us today. Paul gives us categories to understand our own culture and to engage as wise Christians in the struggle for truth. Last section of Dreams and Revolutions. The cultural revolution that I lived through, Peter Jones, is unlike anything in modern Western history, except perhaps the French Revolution, when a civilization influenced by a small minority rejected its religious and philosophical roots to adopt an ideology antithetically opposed to all that it had known. From its founding until the 60s, American culture was defined by patriarchal, heterosexual, Judeo-Christian presuppositions. In one generation, this worldview has been largely replaced by a radically egalitarian, omnigendered, pansexual, multi-religious, and oneist belief system that has turned our contemporary world upside down. There was another revolutionary time like ours. In AD 312, the pagan Roman Empire converted to the Christian faith. And I'm going to add, at least in name, because there's some debate whether Constantine was a genuine Christian or not. But nonetheless, Constantine professed Christianity. And he turned away from the deeply ingrained polytheism and widespread sexual license in order to adopt, imperfectly to be sure, biblical ways and standards. And this is what we ended with last week. Constantine's nephew, affectionately known as Julian the Apostate, later tried to promote a revolutionary return to paganism, eliminating Christians from teaching and military service and promoting the official worship of Isis, goddess of magic and the underworld. Julian failed. His famous last words in AD 360 as he finally submitted to Jesus were, "You've conquered, Galilean." Ironically, the real American Revolution in the 1960s, not the one in 1776, returns us to the pagan empire that Julian so desperately wanted to restore. Julian's wish is being fulfilled today. Let me hit this, take your questions, and then go to the presentation, the lecture. So here we are in the 1960s, right? Go backwards a little bit, but enter the 1960s after Carl Jung. You have the catchy little song, which I'm sure we all find ourselves singing here and there, the dawning of the age of Aquarius. Do you know what Aquarius succeeded? What age was before that? The age of the Pisces. Now, I'm not asking us to turn to, a zodiacal calendar and understanding, but this song's understanding of Pisces and what they mean by the dawning of the age of Aquarius is to overcome the age of the fish. What's associated? What religious system is associated with the fish?
Christianity.
Bingo, Christianity. That's what the song means, right? And so Christians did not say we're in the age of Pisces. They're not going to go ahead and go along with that. But their take, when you listen to the lyrics, is to overcome the age of the fish, to overturn all of this. And you can argue that, at least from a sociological point of view, they succeeded. They're never going to conquer Christ, right? But as far as the worldly system, if they didn't succeed, certainly in Rome, because there's been a surge in Eastern philosophies, particularly all of the Eastern isms. Go back to what Peggy said with TM, Transcendental Meditation, and I said, you see all of those coming in. These are the two big ones, but even if we had a study of these two classes, you would see, especially under Buddhism, you would see that's the big umbrella, and all of the offshoots and all of the sects, S-E-C-T-S, that come from that really merge into the new Gnosticism. Shirley MacLaine, standing on the seashore crying out at the end of her documentary, I am God, I am God, I am God. And she introduces, or at least popularizes, what became the New Age movement, where you are God. You have that within you. You just have to tap into it and figure out how to overcome. Don't worry about the guilt. Don't worry about the bad things that happen to you. Liberation is finding out who you really are, and who you really are as a God, or actually more accurately, a goddess. Even you men really need to turn to Gaia, the earth goddess, nature, because that is who really guides us. Has this infiltrated the church? It has. You do see it in some of the word faith movements, some of the name it and claim it, more radical edges of the charismatic movement. But you're going to see this in what's called progressive or liberal Christianity as well. I remember when I was in the Presbyterian Church USA, PCUSA, just like this church once upon a time was a part of the NACCC, National Association of Congregational Churches, where you, even today, that denomination has pockets of evangelicals, but as a denomination is lurching left. Well, the PCUSA that I was in, it was my first church, that Presbyterian one. This church is just a tad older. Great Valley was 1710. Here we have 1694, right? But still two very old churches. Great Valley evangelical, PCUSA, no, right? Lurching left big time. We eventually pulled out of that denomination, but while I was there, part of an assignment given to me by the elders as the associate was to research the current happenings of the PCUSA at the national level. And there was something called the Reimagining Conference. And this was primarily by the PCUSA. This was only back in, well, early 2000s, but we'll say 3, 4, somewhere around there, 2003, 4, where this was at the national gathering, what we call General Assembly. And you had eco-feminist theologians standing up on behalf of the PCUSA, and we're going to take communion. Now, today we're actually going to take real communion, but they took communion, not grape juice or wine and bread, no, milk and honey, in the name of Sophia, the goddess of wisdom. And their justification was in Proverbs 8, I believe it is, where wisdom cries aloud in the streets. Well, from a literary point of view, that's just personification. No, we're wrong. Sophia is the feminine noun, and wisdom is clearly speaking there, they say. And so that's actually the female deity, the fourth member of the Godhead. And I still don't know, what do you call that? A quadrinity? I don't know. Trinity? What do you call four? Whatever that is, there should be four. And in their hierarchy, if you will, Sophia is really at the top. This was done and then not rebuked at the National Assembly. And when I reported on that, we said, time to put things in motion. And we did. So it's making its way into the church. There are many spiritual paths, only one ultimate religion. Roughly a third of professing evangelicals today believe that. Roughly a third believe this statement, the second bullet point. Newsweek in 2009 looked at the spiritual landscape of America and said we're all Hindus now because of all of the isms that came in the 60s. And I don't think they're wrong. What has this led to today? Spiritual people, but based on Hinduism, and I throw Buddhism in there. Transformation at the species level. This is what not only Jung was advocating for, but many of his successors and many of the proponents of getting in touch with the esoteric. Remember, Jung wanted to get rid of the opposites. Any conflict, get rid of it, right? And then the Red Book came out his personal diary where he got these revelations from his spirit god Philemon. And Philemon had been teaching him that we need to get rid of that which is opposite, including male and female. That's not a true person. This is Gnosticism. Gnosticism's belief was that the true person was an androgynous being. You had to get to this one being. And this one being was neither male nor female. That's matter. Get rid of that. Get rid of all these things that separate us. Become one. Well, it's still there, right? Transgenderism. Think of how this has launched over the past 5 years. I mean, skyrocketed, right? Skyrocketed. Heavy emphasis on inner feelings and inner truth. And I'll tell you, it is very difficult. And you know this as well as I do, maybe even more so, how hard it is to have discussions with people, to have even the friendliest debate when it's based on what they feel and what they believe is true, and you don't have a right to question truth or introduce anything that is objective. To the point where you just go, actually, this is actually pointless for us to go further. We're just going to get mad at each other and frustrated, right? Let me pause there before I turn to his lecture and say questions, comments. Are you seeing this in American society? What are your thoughts? Is this starting to at least take shape in your mind here, this Oneist, Twoist, and are you seeing it in society? I'm not saying look for the devil under every rock, but I think some of it's pretty obvious. Yes.
There's a huge spiritual center in Raynham. It's a Buddhist temple, and it's called the Spiritual Center.
Interesting. Raynham.
Right across from Walmart.
Walmart.
The largest in the country, if not North America.
Whoa, it's that big.
Oh, it's huge.
Yeah, right off of Route 24.
I will have to drive by it and check this thing out. Wow. There were some big ones. There were big Buddhist temples being built up, near Chelmsford as well, but not to that extent, it sounds like.
It doesn't look as much like a temple, though, because we
Right.
drove around it because we were curious. It looks more, I think it's called a Spiritual Education Center. Is that what it's called? Okay, yeah.
Interesting.
Considered I guess market is the word, as an educational center, and they promote, I don't want to say retreats, but, coming together and classes and, they rent it out to people women that just want to go and do yoga.
Okay.
That type of place.
So just a general come one, come all spiritual center. Yes. Oh, it's a big building then. Okay.
Yes.
I was shocked to find out some of my most dependable congregants were going to see spiritualists with friends. And that was shocking. I mean, that's how it influenced my churches, because you don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's supposed to be fun.
Right.
I sure did let them know the dangers of that. And if you got a demon in, you're in trouble.
Well put. Our brother, retired pastor, speaking from experience. And I told you the similar story last year. So some of his former congregants, were seeing spiritualists, right? And I told you the same thing. When I was up at my former church, we had some people practicing the occult, and they didn't think it was wrong because it's really, I was just looking at a pendulum and talking to Uncle Bob, who's dead. What? Right? So, but it's frightening. But I had to put myself in that person's shoes. They didn't think it was wrong. So I tried to say from there, not agree with them, but say, all right, let me warn them, but what would cause you to do this? Right? I'm trying to understand that. And it's prevalent. It is very much prevalent. Yes.
What is paying for things like that? It's such a large building, right?
Oh, the spiritual center, who's paying for the one in Raynham?
Yeah, where's all the money kind of.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Oh, so I can comment on that. My local did most of the construction.
Oh. Who paid your bills?
Well, it was paid by I don't know if he's the president or the king of Thailand. Yeah. From foreign money.
Okay.
Oh, Thailand, you said.
Yeah.
Oh, so this is foreign monies coming in from the east,
Yeah.
from Thailand. Okay. Fascinating.
That's where they said.
That's
Oh,
right.
tons of
Well,
money.
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's what,
Exactly.
yeah. Okay. All right, so I'm looking at time. Let me go ahead and play this. This will take us to the end and then leave you with some teasers as we move in. So this is Paganism in the Spotlight.
The spirituality about which I spoke, which essentially is represented as a sort of hidden esoteric tradition, I believe comes to the surface openly in the 60s and represents thus the fulfillment of Jung's vision of a society liberated to practice pagan spirituality. That's the basic argument that I'm proposing to you. For some of us watched this happen, didn't we? We saw all of a sudden this outbreak of the most bizarre kind of spirituality we never heard before. When you have Shirley MacLaine out on a limb announcing, "I am God," and we had to wonder when this odd limb would break and we would come back to our senses. But we discovered that what she was representing was what was called the New Age movement. Don't ever use that phrase ever again, because the progressives don't use it either. But we were introduced via that amazingly beautiful song, The Age of Aquarius, into a notion of the change of the times, that something very profound and strange was happening. This indeed was the dawning of the Age of Aquarius. Incidentally, Jung in his writings was a popularizer of the notion of the Age of Aquarius. So there's nothing left to chance here. The Age of Aquarius is that moment in the zodiacal system where the age of Pisces, which stood for the fish, is now superseded by the Age of Aquarius, the age of the goddess water bringer, of spiritual drink. And by the way, Jung was known as the father of the New Age movement, as well as being called the father of neo-Gnosticism and the psychologist of the 21st century. Just so that you know that when I made reference to Jung, that I wasn't going out on a limb, yes, with Shirley MacLaine. But I think there's something to be said for finding him at the center of things. But as a matter of fact, the 60s was but the dawning of the Age of Aquarius, as that song says. Dylan asked us what time was it, and he said the times were a-changin'. Now, as I say, all generations see the change of times, but I think that this was a very different kind of change. It was this extraordinary, catastrophic change, as that feminist historian spoke of. Dylan was announcing a radical departure from everything that the West had known in the past to something seemingly brand new. David Horowitz and Peter Collier, who were Marxist students, leaders of the SDS in Berkeley in the 60s, who finally went back on all of that stuff and wrote the book Destructive Generation about the 60s revolution, understood that at the heart of the revolution was not simply drugs and sex, but it was also the destruction of Western civilization. If you want to hear this man, he's an amazing person, David Horowitz. You can find him on Google him. He has incredible insights as to what is happening right now. He's a Jewish agnostic, by the way. But what we were actually seeing in the 60s, I believe, was a pagan revival. Ex-Roman Catholic Jungian Gnostic by the name of Mark Gaffney describes this time as a serendipitous confluence of events. That is to say, an unforeseen but delightful turn of events where you have the decline of Christianity and the growth of these alternate spiritualities. And so many spiritualities got their start here in the 60s. A pantheistic spiritual revival took place. I'll just run through a few of them. The American Indian Vision Quest, the Akashic Record, the Ayurvedic medicine, chakras, Eastern meditation of all kinds, Ekankar, which is soul travel, Feng Shui, Hare Krishna, karma, mandalas, mantras, reincarnation, shamanism, Sufism, Tai Chi, Tantrism, I Ching, to mention just a few. And these, for many people, have become dominant notions in the identification of spirituality in our once Christian West. That's why I said earlier, many people now are turning away from secular humanism and they're saying, we're spiritual but not religious. What they mean by that is, you see, that they are looking for a notion of spirituality freed from the doubts of secular humanism, but totally eliminating the notion of religion, and in particular the Christian religion, which is not to be found within, but is a revelation from the outside. So the New Age has morphed into the age of interfaith religion, where everything is good. Jung already affirmed this. Our world has shrunk, and it is dawning on us that humanity is one, with one psyche. This should prompt Christians, for the sake of charity, to set a good example and acknowledge that though there is only one truth, it speaks in many tongues. So that's the message now you often hear, is it not? There's one truth, but it speaks in many tongues. This is where we must situate the so-called interfaith movement that you've obviously come across in your own churches, where you've been asked to participate in some kind of a drive for homeless people because there's an interfaith group here. Well, some of that is harmless, obviously, but the driving ideology behind interfaith is this notion of the coming of pagan spirituality. A Christian eco-feminist theologian by the name of Heather Eaton argues that the Christian faith must now exhibit an openness to reinterpretations in the light of the myriad religious traditions, and a willingness to be transformed by the inter-religious dialogue. You see, you move in that direction, and then, after all, what you thought about Christianity has to change radically, of course. And so, the modern religious person needs to encounter many religious perspectives and be transformed by the process. Terribly seductive, right? And if you don't do that, you're an old fogey. You're stuck in some kind of historical ravine, and you are not showing that you're open to the future, which, by the way, is turning back to the past, right? In the old pagan religion. So don't buy that kind of argumentation. And you're asked to see the future of Christianity as just one religious option among many. And so we find ourselves in the beginning of this 21st century, where the marginal 60s spirituality has become mainstream. We thought that the New Age hippies from the West Coast were going to last as long as bell-bottom pants and the hula hoop. And actually, that has gone mainstream. That old phrase I just already cited, I'm spiritual but not religious, you see, shows that it has gone mainstream. So many people are now claiming to be spiritual, because we are all convinced of what Jung was telling us, that the divine reigns within us, and that because our inner psyches are in control, then our fantasies are morally justified. It brings us psychological health. It brings us the completion of ourselves, and indeed, hopefully, the health of the planet. All this is intertwined in this vision, you see. In other words, broken Humpty Dumpty of contemporary Western humanity, broken by the demise of secular humanism, deconstructed by postmodernism, needs a new organizing core. You know, in Western universities today, philosophy is in ruins because postmodernism says secular humanism doesn't work. So what do you do? Well, what's the new core? It's found actually not in the rational, but in the irrational. See that flip? You don't find it in logos, but in mythos, not in word, but in myth. That's how we will put the world back together again, say these folks. But not just in terms of personal healing. This is a massive movement, and that's why I'm taking my time to open it up to you, because it's not simply for personal healing. This vision of the world, a pagan vision, is being applied to all of existence, to science, law, education, politics, sexuality, ecology, and ethics. All must be filtered through this subjective paranormal grill of a sort of occultic vision of human beings. That's the future, I believe. That's on the way. You talk about, spiritual combat. This is where we're going, and I do feel that we need to be forearmed in order to be able to stand against it. A whole reinterpretation of existence is now being done, obviously for the sake of the planet. We're reinventing the human, says Thomas Berry. A modern Jungian philosopher from Australia explains this organizing core principle. Quote, "Our age is destined to discover the divine as a dimension of the human." Do you see that? And explicitly characterizes this thorough Oneist notion as the essential project of Jung's new humanism. So this redefinition of the human, you see, is really the fulfillment of what Jung was looking for, a new humanity. Who on earth ever thought that this would be what we would see at the beginning of the 21st century in Christian America? Based upon this notion of God, you see, that I described to you, which was Jung's notion of Abraxas, half man, half beast, a God higher than both the Christian God and the devil, combining all the opposites. That sounds a little old-fashioned, but this Jungian Australian scholar, David Tacey, actually gives it a little modern twist. Let us agree that the old image of God is dead and buried. The image of a supernatural deity who has objective existence. We can't believe in that anymore, right? If you're a normal human being these days. That is a human invention that education and science can no longer sustain. Today, only sentimentalists, fundamentalists, and unthinking people like you want to return to that antiquated image. We need to discover God anew. Here's the radical character of this new spirituality, you see. It's not content to let people go off in the corner and meditate on themselves. Now we must impose this new vision of existence upon everybody. This will be the dominant worldview. Now, of course, this is good news for unrepentant sinners. Billy Graham used to say, "This is good news. God loves the sinner and I love to sin." That was Billy Graham's funny line. And you can be taken further now, you see, because the good news is even more encouraging. Sinners are God. And what's sin anyway? Last week, the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church declared that sin is no longer an operative notion in the modern world. This is the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. We are in deep kimchi, folks, when we get to that stage that we can just dismiss out of hand one of the fundamental notions of biblical truth. But that's where we are. The British sociologist Christopher Partridge is a wonderful sociologist. I think he's a Christian. His book is entitled The Re-Enchantment of the West. The Re-Enchantment of the West. Christopher Partridge in 2004 made a timely observation about this phenomenon. Many are now convinced that the contemporary world has much to learn from pre-modern and primal cultures. That's a fancy way of saying paganism, obviously. This is, of course, what he's talking about, which I've described to you as the new humanism. Well, when I stood in Boston in 1964 and began to breathe in this amazing reality of a Christian America, I never dreamt that in 2014 that I would look out and see and read what I'm reading today. I've already mentioned that this Jewish sociologist, Philip Goldberg, in his book, The American Veda, From Emerson and the Beatles to Yoga and Meditation, How Indian Spirituality Changed the West, is now telling us that America has become Hindu. We're all Hindus now, said Newsweek in 2009. Large numbers of Americans are espousing this worldview of Hinduism, talking about mantras and mandalas and avatars and karma and all these terms, and practicing yoga in the schools and mindfulness, which is a Buddhist form of meditation, in the schools. Out in California, we've just fought a court battle, and lost, by the way, against yoga being taught in the schools. So you can say that this vision of paganism is winning and being applied even in the schools these days. And as I mentioned to you, it's good to, I see the board is clean, so it isn't up there anymore, but that term Advaita, says Goldberg, is the fundamental notion, which means not two. And so we are swallowing down, you see, this oneist ideology that everything is one, which successfully eliminates God who is separate, right? You want to have a God who's separate? Well, he doesn't exist anymore. Everything is one, and this is the way we will build the world from now on. And so we give plenty of time to the Dalai Lama to teach us about peace and other things, to teach us how we can discover Eastern spiritual pacifism. As I mentioned, we have yoga in the schools. In Canada, it's the Buddhist Mind Up program. And we practice yoga at the White House, as does the power couple, Bill and Hillary Clinton. Well, what produced this massive turn to the East? Well, obviously, I believe that Jung is powerfully involved, but at the same time, something took place in 1893 at the Parliament of the World's Religions. I attended the Parliament of the World's Religions 100 years later, by the way. I just missed it, which was an amazing experience. I might have time to tell you about it. But in 1893, the original one, there was the meeting of 4,000 basically liberal Christians. And they wanted to look out on the world, but they invited a Hindu guru by the name of Vivekananda, who taught about the God within and yoga, and blew away many of these people in attendance. And a number of Americans were deeply influenced by this man, including, by the way, Carl Jung. Carl Jung himself was fascinated by Eastern mysticism. He declared in 1932, "We have conquered the East politically, but now the spirit of the East is really antes portas," Latin for at the door. So our present culture is following Jung's fascination with, guess what? Yoga. With Hindu spirituality. And actually, Jung predicted that the West would produce a yoga based on Christianity. And all these predictions are coming true. How odd. Number of people doing yoga now is phenomenal. 15,000 sites advertise yoga programs in New York alone. 15,000. If this was Bible studies, we'd say this is a Christian revival, right? Rather, it's a new form of spirituality. Jung in the 50s predicted we are only at the threshold of a new spiritual epoch. I believe that the theories about the unconscious were ushering in a new age of the Paraclete, the end of the Christian era, the coming of the age of Aquarius. Jung's prediction of a new Pentecost has caught on. Brother Wayne Teasdale, a lay monk and teacher of interspirituality, combines the traditions of Christianity, Hinduism, and Buddhism, and calls this time in which we are now living an interspiritual age. But Barbara Marx Hubbard, who is a progressivist, a leader of this movement, talks about a new Pentecost. Way back in the middle of the 20th century, Jung's dismantling of a Twoist worldview in thinking about God and the world produced a spiritual oneism, and this has had massive repercussions in today's world. Again, I'd like to cite Partridge. There is some evidence to suggest that the rising tide of spirituality, this was in 2004, I think he said it, is producing a re-enchantment of the world by Gnostic Hindu spirituality. The shift in the West means that the center of spiritual gravity is moving away from Judeo-Christian theology to an eclecticism of what he calls occulture. It's a nice way of talking about the occult. A Dutch historian of religions talks about the profound transformation of religion in the West away from traditional Christianity to what he calls magic. And then finally, a brilliant pagan philosopher by the name of Richard Tarnas says we are living in one of those rare ages that brings forth through great stress and struggle a genuinely fundamental transformation in the underlying assumptions and principles of the cultural worldview. He talks about the coming of the great synthesis. So we have people now describing the present day as the fourth great awakening, the great emergence, the great shift, the new Pentecost. The whole system will have a makeover. A totalizing oneness civilization is in preparation. Some Christians are mesmerized by all this and believe that only good days are ahead, failing to understand, it seems to me, the influences that produce this culture and this optimism in our time. We need to seriously study the sources of this material and bring the gospel to bear upon it. Thank you.
So what Jung or what happens is we jump forward, like I said, to the 60s, and you now have this dawning of not only the age of Aquarius, but you have the dawning of a new sexuality, and that becomes huge in society. So in back when I was in high school in the in the 80s, homosexuality was there, but by no means societally was it accepted. No means. Shamefully, and this is before I was a believer, I'd make derogatory comments, right? And I say shamefully because I don't think we should do that. That's not a loving thing, right? Disagree is one thing. Derogatory comments is a different thing, right? But not to justify what I was doing, but I was by no means the only one doing it, because it was something that you did not practice. Now, with that particular topic, something happened. If you remember with Proposition 8 out in California, the whole gay marriage thing, do you remember what ethnic group primarily was responsible for tipping the scales in terms of voting it down the first time? It was the Black community. The Black community in California voted it down the first time. They weren't the only ones, but they were the ones who tipped it. And a new strategy appeared. Now, the reason that they voted it down, and I remember even asking some of my, I've quite a number of African-American friends, and I was asking them, what's up? Because not every African-American is a believer, and I know that not every African-American is conservative in his or her politics. So I'm a little surprised, pleasantly surprised, but a little surprised. And the answer I got from a number of my friends was culturally, this is a no-no. This is not accepted. And so there's only so far we can go. This is not a civil rights issue. This is a moral issue. Culturally, there is still a Judeo-Christian ethic in much of the African-American community. Whether that is going back to Dr. King's version of Christianity, or AME Zion, largely a Black denomination, but just in general, you're going to have that. But then there was a shift, and the shift was, we will paint this as, and we will market it as a civil rights issue. And this is not, we need to take it out of the moral realm. And if we present this as a people group who are oppressed by the systemic, by systemic discrimination, then we have a better chance of passing this. And that is what happened. If you notice, if you go back 2008, 9, 10, you start to hear the national verbiage change. The national verbiage then becomes, the people who are oppressed are minorities and the primarily the homosexual. This is really even before transgender, but the LGBTQ plus community. And they start to equate the two. And I remember talking to friends saying, there's a categorical difference. You can't equate the two. The color of my skin is different than, admittedly, a very complex set of characteristics or situations that may lead someone to choose homosexuality or to feel that they are by nature homosexual, but nonetheless, it is a choice that you make, meaning it's one that you can choose not to make. Now, I'm not saying it's easy. I don't ever want to paint with a broad brushstroke. Those who struggle with that temptation and that lifestyle, it is a struggle, but it functions much like addictions. That's still different than whether I'm Black, white, Asian, Latino, etc. So, but once it was painted that way, then it becomes voted in. And just like the reading earlier, and he touches on this in much of the lecture, you start to see the laws of the land change. So now we are running risks legally in the eyes of Caesar, if you will, if we speak against any of the lifestyles, LGBTQ, etc. Certainly societally, we are painted as what? What are some of the names that are thrown at us? homophobe, bigot, intolerant. Oh, that's a big one. Intolerant. Such a bad interpretation of that, right? And so intolerance versus, no, I'm having a conversation with you. I'm not saying that you should be killed at all, right? Because I am not what's called a theonomist. I don't believe that the law of the Old Testament is to be and the law of God is to be the law of America, that we just lift that out, including the punishments. That was a sin that was punishable by death in the Old Covenant. But that part of the law has been fulfilled in Christ, right? That is the civil law. And the civil law, that which governed theocratic Israel, has been fulfilled in Christ. But the moral law, homosexuality itself, is still in effect, just not the civil punishments for it. So I don't believe that you should be stoned or killed or anything like that, right? But I still think it's wrong. And I think it's bad for society, but it's also bad for your soul. But that is seen as incredibly bigoted, intolerant, etc. Now, in certain circles, what are we also possibly facing? We are possibly facing laws against us. I think it's only a matter of time. Now, actually, I tend not to be a pessimist, but I just see the writing on the wall. I think it's a matter of time before this becomes, speaking out against it becomes an official hate crime. I think we're right there. I think we're right there. I pray it's not that way, but I don't think we're far away. And I wouldn't be surprised if it happens. So we see certain people being targeted because of their views. Well, behind all of this, the philosophy behind all of this is what Peter Jones was talking about, and what Young was, as he's pointing to Young, it is the Gnostic idea of getting rid of rational mind, rational thought, any distinctions, embrace the contradictions, so that all is one and one is all. So in the end, you have neither male nor female. Well, that sounds like Galatians 3:28, only very different. Because there it's talking about in Christ, right? There's no higher spiritual plane for a man than a woman or something like that. But they're saying, no, actually get rid of it, because Christianity does recognize the role for man and the role for woman, right? That's a beautiful part of God's creation. It's a necessary part of God's creation. But society, it's not. And so we no longer say societally that you were born male or female. What's the new verbiage?
Gender assigned at birth.
Gender assigned.
At birth.
At birth. I was assigned this by that nasty pediatrician, I guess, who made an obvious call, right? Yes.
Talk about follow the science.
Yeah. Follow the science.
The genetic things that they talk about all the time with that ridiculous statement.
And I'm with you, Ken. And here's where I need to bite my tongue and my lip, because it is ridiculous, right? You just go, really?
Like what you said before, it's embrace the contradiction.
Well, that's it. To the point where there are a number of physicians who just can't, right? And say no. But when you speak out, what's another part of today's society? You are what? You're canceled. You're canceled or you're doxxed. What does dox mean? So we can all be kind of hip. By the way, I was told when I was in youth ministry, if you say hip, you're no longer actually hip, right? So, but that's okay. I never tried to be hip. So, but what does dox mean? D-O-X-X. Because you're going to see that dox means to reveal, to call out, to publicly reveal.
Publish your name, your address.
Exactly.
Your workplace.
I will take everything about you and put it online. I will do what LeBron James just did to that policeman who shot that young lady. And that policeman, I'm sure, is carrying some guilt, but from what we can tell, that's a different type of killing. Now, she was killed, so I'm going to call it a killing. I'm not calling it a murder. Please hear me. She was killed. That's different than what Officer Chauvin did to George Floyd. Very, very different, which is why you have a number of police coming and saying, at the very least, give the guy his day in court. right? What about due process? But no, LeBron James, what did he do? He doxed him. He put his picture, he put his name, and LeBron James has 50 million followers on his Twitter account.
50 million.
50 million people now know where this man lives and now know his name. And it was hashtag accountability, you're next. That's a threat. And thankfully, there are groups, you're getting societal pushback, but you're actually getting legal pushback, saying you actually made a public threat against someone. And so we'll see where this comes from. But that, I'm just using that as a high profile example, but that happens a lot. I was during this pandemic, right? During this pandemic, early on, I had pulled some numbers from, now I'm going to forget his name. He had a Greek last name, if memory serves, but he was a guy out at Stanford who was a numbers guy, a statistician. And he was looking at some of the early projections. The pandemic had just hit us. And it was doom and gloom, right? You remember that. We're all going to die. And he said, look, I'm not saying this is something light or to be taken, lightly, but I don't think that the numbers add up. And he had correctly predicted the number who would die during the swine flu and during, oh my gosh, the outbreak, Ebola outbreak over in Africa. He's a numbers guy, and he's like, this is what we can expect. And his were much larger than what was coming out from, and this is not a Biden-Trump thing. Trump was there at the time, and it was coming out under Trump and Fauci and all these types of people. And this was a scientist, right? A statistician is a scientist. It's just a different type of science. Psychology is a science. It's just a different type of science than, say, chemistry or virology or anything. And so I put that up there on my page, and I said, at this point, I can argue from my scientist, you can argue from your scientist. This was on my Facebook page. Let's just stop arguing and start to have debates. Well, a former student, when I taught at LCA, I got tagged, thankfully, right? Facebook actually did alert me that my page had been shared, which she took a screenshot of it, put it on her page, thankfully put my name out, thankfully, like whited it out or just blurred it, and said, this is precisely the type of people we need to have offline. Me. Because this is not how science works. I thought, no, this is how science works. This is the scientific discovery, but she came that close to doxing me. And I thought, just because I put something on there you disagree with. That's the society we live in, right? That's the society we live in. So I'll hit you with one more thing and take a question here, and then we'll wrap up. Back with the whole bathroom bill a few years ago. When I was at Emmanuel, we were debating, what do we do? Right now, it wasn't much like here. We had we did have some bathrooms because it was we had a gymnasium associated, and we had a basketball league. So we had male only and female only and showers in those bathrooms. But we had a number of single sex bathrooms as well. So we just thought, all right, the only challenge is if someone wants to come and make their way to the back of the building, which chances are you didn't on a Sunday morning as a visitor, right? You weren't going to go back to the gym too much unless you came to Sunday school with us. Unless someone wants to find only those two bathrooms, or no, there were some up front too, and not take our suggestion to use the unisex bathroom, then we're probably okay, right? It's not that big of a deal. When I went to, I was attending a lecture at Gordon Conwell, and I was going to speak for part of the class, but the lecturer who was going to precede me, I asked my buddy who was teaching the class, can I come in and watch that guy? Because he is a law professor at Gordon College, and he is a Christian lawyer on the North Shore. Myron Walters, Gwyn Walters was, yep. So Gwyn, the former preacher there, his son, Myron. And Myron is at the Presbyterian Church in Ipswich. And he gave a speech on legal things Christians should know. And this was to a group of soon to graduate pastors. But I thought, I'd like to know some of this too, right? So I'm watching, and he said, here is the advice my firm gives. Now, it's two guys at his firm, but my firm gives to our clients, most of whom are churches here in Eastern Massachusetts. for the time being, now this was whatever, 5 years ago, 4 years ago, for the time being, do not host any outside group that is not an official ministry of your church. If you're hosting the Boy Scouts, let the lease run out or the contract run out and don't renew it. Don't renew Alcoholics Anonymous, all these things that Christians tend to host. He said, I'm not saying that it's bad to host those things. He said, but with the laws, if you host them, even Christian groups that sign, and we had a homeschool co-op meeting at our church. They were not a ministry of our church, but we gladly let them use our building. His advice was don't renew the contract, because if I offer your group a contract and you're not in my budget, my church's budget, and then you're just going to be, not that you would espouse LGBTQ theory, but you're going to be my guinea pig. Okay. Let's say your minister or your group comes in and hears that we've rented out to your group, but now your group wants to come in just because you need space and we have a lot of space. Well, if she's not a part of my budget, then you could actually have a pretty good case, we found out, for discrimination in the eyes of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, because I'm now discriminating against you by choosing her, even as a Christian institution. So he was saying, until we can work all of this out, and until a couple cases that are in the Massachusetts court system are judged, and then we can say, here's the precedent, either definitely obey what I'm saying to you, or you know what, thankfully the judges came to their senses and it's okay. He said, until then, don't do it. So we did. We had a moratorium for, I think, 2 years, and that was hard. Now, we weren't hosting like AA and all that, but we weren't opposed to doing that, right? And it made us feel very isolated and separatistic. But we also thought we have to watch out for the church. Thankfully, I think some of that has passed, but I will say this for now. We always have to keep our eyes open because this is our society. So next week, we're going to switch gears a little bit and specifically focus on two things: wokeism and critical race theory. Because the big question today is not, are you a oneist? It's, are you woke? And if you're not woke, that's a bad thing. So what does that mean? First of all, I can't stand the word. But second of all, besides that, what does it mean? And where did it come from? Where did this come from? Because it dominates society. So if you want to be hip, come learn what wokeism is and see if you're woke. All right. Let me pray for us. I'm just watching that we got to get over there. Father, thank you for